Good morning and welcome to our next webinar in our Quickfire webinar series. I'm Chris Harvey. Today's session is on the anatomy of a successful product recall. So if you've not joined these Quickfire sessions in the past, they're more conversational style. This one's probably meant for a little bit more audience that's junior to product recalls, where Matt and I are going to unpeel a little bit of what we've learned throughout our years in product recalls from just what's been successful. So what are some of the things that you can think about and take back to your team, and what are you doing, what are you not doing, and you might be able to tweak things as well. And hopefully, just because you've joined this webinar, you understand that recalls happen and you want to be better prepared for them. Be on the lookout. One of our next webinars, Quickfire, that we're going to do is a little bit more pre-recall, some of the decision making leading up to a recall. So be on the lookout for that in the future. We will also have a webinar in August for our quarterly recall index that examines a lot of the trends and data of what's going on with product recalls around the globe. So be on the lookout for that. We do US, Europe, and Australia. Australia will be probably more in September. But right now it's a very interesting time, so it's good to tune in and find out what's going on in the world of recalls. So again, I'm Chris Harvey. I'm Senior Vice President of Client Services with Sedgwick. I personally have been working on recalls for over 2 decades now, so quite a bit. I'm happy to be joined by my colleague, Matt Walker, who I'll have introduce himself.
Thanks, Chris. So I am Matt Walker. I'm Director of Business Development. So haven't been here as long as Chris, but I am on 15 years, and I've worked on more than 1,000 recalls over that span.
So a lot of experience. So as I alluded to previously, we're in a very interesting time when it comes to the world of product safety, especially around the regulatory environment in the U.S. Whether that's deregulation or a pause on some of the rulemaking. But with that, though, we've seen a very heavy amount of enforcement that's been occurring recently, especially in the consumer product industry. If you work in that industry. Just as far as the number of recalls, the unilateral press releases, and other enforcement actions. So very heavy, so companies need to be very diligent. And then we will look at the other industries too. A lot of them also have higher number of recalls. Now, I do think that's going to continue. I think right now the environment's fairly ripe with the tariffs, the cost of things, with the supply chain disruptions we've been seeing in the last few years, labor shortages, where we've seen a lot of different companies make moves in compliance and regulatory. Unfortunately, I do think we could see a spike in the number of recalls. And then a lot of the companies that are listening in today are globalized. So they're distributing product outside of the US. Last year, Europe saw an unprecedented number of recalls as well. So I think that is going to continue. And this is really why it's important for companies to understand how to run successful recalls. They need to be able to protect, not only from a regulatory standpoint, their standing, but their brand, their reputation, and know how to reduce risk. Litigation is very high in the US and can come about from product recalls. So very important to look at how you're running recalls and what you can potentially do to enhance those. So Matt and I are going to have just an open discussion on some ideas based on our experience as we peel back the anatomy as well. I would ask, though, Matt, how do you define successful recall?
It's a good question. So it's a question we get a lot from manufacturers. How do you define it? So is there a response rate? A lot of manufacturers really look for a certain response rate and expect that response rate for every recall. And that's kind of the guideline that they use in order to determine if it was effective or not. The truth of the matter is that is really an ineffective way of measuring if your recall has been effective. There are a lot of factors that can play a part in what that response rate is. So, what's the hazard? What's the risk? How often is that product used? What's the value of the product? What is the climate like from a social media and media standpoint? So a lot of different factors that really can affect whether it's a high response rate or a low response rate. Also across industries, so pharmaceutical versus consumer product versus medical device. I think a better way of measuring if a recall is effective is, manufacturers have received reports of incidences of injuries, which has led to that product recall. So after you've done your communications, after you've launched and closed your recall, are you still seeing any incidences coming in? Are you still getting reports of injuries? If you are, then it was an ineffective recall. You haven't communicated that well enough. You haven't received the responses that you need, and you may need to take more action. So I think that's a really big piece of how to identify if you've had an effective recall or not, is monitoring that. Another piece is kind of the brand sentiment. So every manufacturer is looking social media wise. What are consumers saying about your organization, Facebook, and all these other social media outlooks? Has that improved, or are you still getting the same complaints on there that you were prior? So I think those are a couple of ways of really looking at it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know we've got a broad range of industries listening in. As Matt alluded to on the FDA side, there could be different class levels. So maybe you're only notifying to a 2 or a 3 distributors, wholesalers, retailers. They're doing recalls, every day, every week. So you should have higher response rates. So those levels would be obviously measured differently than some of the patient levels. And then consumer product recalls with the Consumer Product Safety Commission or the National Highway Traffic Safety Commission on the administration on the automotive side, you're dealing down to that consumer level, who can be more and more difficult to reach nowadays. But I think, Matt, you hit what I always try to say is, are there incidences? Are there injuries continuing? Obviously, that's a good tip, that you're not running an effective recall, that you may want to take additional action. But a lot of different variables, as you mentioned, Matt. So we're going to dive in here. This is a reminder that the audience microphone lines are muted, but you can enter questions into the chat module. We'll save some time at the very end, or if we can peek and see some questions that come throughout, we may try to address those. So definitely enter those into the chat module. So let's start to peel back the anatomy of a successful recall, Matt. And the first part that I always think of for any company, and unfortunately, there's a lot of companies, especially in different industries, that don't really prep for this. But number one is recall readiness. As a company, you can't just assume a recall is not going to happen to you. You can't cross your fingers and just hope. We always say it's not a matter of if, but a matter of when a recall is going to occur. So companies need to accept this, and they need to be properly prepared. Maybe it's not this year or next year, but it's only a matter of time. So taking that serious and understanding it and being prepared up front is probably the number one in the anatomy of a successful recall.
Absolutely.
I would say understanding as a company where are your risks. And there's a lot of data that's publicly available. So whether that's FDA enforcement reports, CPSC data, NHTSA data, we put out, as I alluded to, a quarterly recall index that examines those trends by industry as well. But try to see where are the spotlights? Are products similar to yours being sold, having recalls, or your competitors having recalls? Why is that occurring, and what lessons are learned? And then utilize that data. So then you want to have and build a robust recall plan. And I still get surprised, man, on companies that just have a 1-2 page or no recall plan.
It's dusty.
Yeah, they dust it off because
Yeah.
they haven't used it in 10 years. So it needs to be a robust recall plan that is customized based on the current environment you're in today, because there's always a lot of regulatory changes, and then customized based on the product you sell and the hazards. If you reintroduce new products into the marketplace, so let's say you add a product with a lithium battery in it, add a product that's a controlled substance, you want to make sure you update your recall plan and do it before you actually have an issue. Make sure there's checklists, templates, something that you're going to actively be able to utilize to help guide you in a recall situation. Now, Matt, I always laugh at this with some companies, but is just having a recall plan good enough?
No, absolutely not. So recall plan, the templates, the checklist that Chris touched on, very important, but that's not enough. So beyond that, you need to go through and you actually need to conduct training. So training to your team members, training to all of the people who are going to be involved should a product recall occur. They need to understand what their role is going to be in that recall. Are they going to be pulling data? Are they looking at complaints? Are they identifying, what's the affected model serial number? Team members need to understand what their role is within a product recall. It doesn't really go bear down on one person, but it's a group of people within every organization. So those groups understanding their place within the recall process is very important. Beyond that training piece, though, you then get into your testing. So it's important for them to be trained, but they need to go through something to test their ability to pull the data, to take whatever action that is required from them in the event of a recall. It's important to do that up front when you are preparing for a recall versus in the heat of the moment when you're actually going through a recall. During a recall, everyone, your hair's on fire. You've got a lot of things that you're trying to juggle. So doing that proactively is really important. You have a stress-free environment. You can really see where are there gaps, where are there areas that need to be enhanced, beefed up, or maybe even adjusted because of the new products and whatnot. Beyond that, so even during that stage of training and testing, take a look at your contracts. So look at contracts with suppliers. Understand the role of the supplier should they have a recall. Is the burden placed fully on them? Are you conducting that recall? Also, from a distribution standpoint, your distributors, are they going to be notifying their customers, or are they expecting for you to notify their customers? A lot of times that's written into the contracts and into the language. So get an understanding of each group's role within that recall. Then you also want to look at I'll call them the specialty groups. So retailers, your big box store or even online marketplaces. How are they going to react during a recall? What is their role going to be during a recall? We know from experience, some will notify out themselves. Others will look from some support from the manufacturer, or they may even have a list of approved vendors to do that notification. So understanding that piece from a retail perspective, then going down into HCPs or hospitals, what's the best way of communicating your recall effectively to those HCPs and taking a look at that proactively up front. Chris, I know that you were recently at a roundtable with some retailers. You got some good intel from that.
Yeah, just the same thing to reiterate, the retailers have to deal with recalls on a daily basis. I think the average number of recalls across all the industries launched last year was like 62 recalls every single week. So most of these retailers who are selling a lot of products across different industries, they're having to deal with these recalls. They have a process in place for them. They know recalls are going to happen. Now, we know when a supplier or a manufacturer the seller is selling to a buyer at a retailer, the last thing they want to talk about is what if something goes wrong? What if I have a recall?
Yeah.
But it can be very important to connect those dots and understand what are the expectations? What does this retailer or distributor need if a recall were to happen? Who's going to be paying for what? How is it going to work? How the data is going to be shared? So that came up quite a bit in the consumer product roundtable last week, that these retailers know recalls are going to happen. So make sure you're connected and know those expectations up front. It's going to be very important. Another area, once you've made the decision to recall, within your recall plan, you need to have predefined what are the roles who need to be in the war room for the recall, whether it's quality, regulatory, legal, communications. Sometimes you want to go light on marketing and sales as well, but make sure you have that predefined. You can get together and then you follow your plan. There's three things I always say that you want to make sure you're properly prepared for to protect your brand and reduce risk: speed, transparency, and empathy. You have to be able to be equipped to move very quickly. You can't be seen as dragging your feet. It's not good for the brand. You have to move quickly from a regulatory standpoint, but also just protecting your brand. Transparency, you can't be seen as hiding things. You can't be seen as watering down things, which are not good. The agency will call that out. The patients or consumers need to know this is an issue and they need to take action as well. And then empathy. I'm not saying, apologize up and down quite a bit, but you want to include empathy. You have inconvenienced the marketplace, your customers, consumers, patients. So you want to make sure you include that, I think. You want to make sure you have that up front so you can control that narrative. Because if you're not controlling it, someone else is, and that's not good for a brand.
Yeah, absolutely. And not to beat up on anyone who's within marketing here and joining the call, but Chris touched on transparency. Marketing teams, they do want to at times kind of water down that language, smooth it over, make sure it's clear to your end consignees. Beyond that, you need to look at what's your corrective action plan, your recall strategy. You really need to customize that based on your recall, based on your product, based on that hazard. A lot of times we see manufacturers who they've had a recall a year ago or a month ago, and they try to do the same process for the new recall. It's not a one size fits all. You really need to look at your specific recall and see what's going to be the best process, the best way of handling that from a remedy standpoint, from a communication standpoint, from a product return standpoint. Look at all of those factors. No two recalls are created equally. So that's something that manufacturers need to be cognizant of and really think through in the event of a recall. Beyond that, so I said, now, one size doesn't fit all. But we do see some manufacturers who really try to make their entire, customer base happy. They try to satisfy all. It's important to have options for customers. It's becoming more and more of a requirement, obviously. But sometimes we do see manufacturers try to have an option for every customer. It really kind of complicates the process, and makes it a little more difficult for a consumer to choose their remedy that they're looking for. So try to simplify it as much as possible to make it as streamlined as possible. It also saves some of the burden on the manufacturer while also making those consumers whole. Chris, I know that you oftentimes reference a 95/5 rule that kind of ties into that as well.
Yeah, it's one of the things that really helps with this is bringing the right people in and somewhat early on in a recall situation. I know you want to control who all you bring in, but you have to get the big picture. And the 95/5% rule I always use is a lot of times these companies will think about what's the happy path of what's going to happen. And maybe that occurs 95% of the time, but 5% of the time they miss something. And you're not going to prevent all of it all the time, but 5% of the time they miss something, they weren't thinking of something, and they actually end up flipping it. They spend 95% of their time in the recall dealing with that 5%. So this is why it's really important to have the right people up front, and to think about the specifics of this recall. The recall plan is your overall guidebook, but when it comes down to the recall, as Matt mentioned, you have to look at the specifics of it. So did you normally distribute the product in red, but you had a Halloween product in black, or you missed a dash in a model number that's causing a lot of confusion, or you missed distributed in X location outside of the United States that you completely missed, and you're spending all of your time. So long story short there, it's really important to think about and ID the scope of the recall, pull in the right people, because again, that's where I see companies get hung up on quite a bit. So first identifying the what, the who, the how, what's involved in the recall situation, who do you need to notify, who do you need to pull in, and how are you going to be doing it specific to that recall. And I always advise in your recall plan, have a document or a checklist that you fill out on the what, the who, and the how specific to that particular recall. One of the areas I'll mention too is the remedy. It's not always a one-size-fits-all with the remedy. Just because you may have done a replacement for one recall, you have to think about how does that impact your next recall? Do you have available parts and so on? Is it the right fit? As Matt alluded to, there's contributing factors to the response levels. So if it's an old product that 10 years ago, they may not want a replacement. They may want a refund. Now, hopefully you can continue to keep them with their same brand. You may, replacement, they may not use it anymore. So you have to think about the particulars of the recall to make sure you're running it successful, and to incentivize consumers to actually take action to respond, or incentivize other customers or patients to respond as well.
Absolutely.
All right, so the next area we want to peel back on. So let's say you've got a recall plan in place. How are you going to run the recall? And this is where I've seen some companies get into trouble. Each recall is different from the next. So you're spending the time identifying what are the potential response levels to identify, can you, from a logistics standpoint, from your current infrastructure standpoint, execute all the attributes of the recall around the entire recall lifecycle. And it may not be the same. You may need help in certain areas. So how do you identify the potential response levels? Matt alluded to this a little bit earlier. The big one is, what's the hazard? A violation versus a fire hazard can be big. Has there been deaths, injuries? Can really pull in the media. How large is the product can pull in the media? But how recent has the product been distributed? Was the product distributed 10 years ago and they're less likely to utilize? Lower response rate. Was it distributed a few weeks ago? Higher response rates. How often is it utilized? Is it something that, you're recalling a snowblower in the middle of July? Could have a lower response rate until the winter time. If you're recalling like a cell phone, which people use and have in their hands probably every other minute, that's going to have a very high response rate. So number one, when you're looking at it, what's the potential response rates? That's going to differ from recall to recall. And then you start to look at around the life cycle, how are you going to be executing it, and are there gaps? So, for example, notifications. You're sending out a bunch of notifications out to the marketplace, but for this particular product, how are you getting the data, as Matt mentioned earlier? Is there hundreds of thousands of consumers that you now have to do email blasts or physical notifications on? How are you going to be doing that? But can you do that, within the first few days of the recall, or you're going to be staggered with it. So you want to go around and think about, the different stages. And Matt, I think you've got a couple other steps.
And tying into the notifications and the response level. So from a call center perspective, yes, maybe a manufacturer handles calls from consumers currently, but if you have an elevated case or you have a situation that affects millions of units, hundreds of thousands of units, it's a severe risk. Can you handle the call volume that comes from those notifications that go out, or that comes from that product recall? Do you have the ability to ramp up your agent staffing in order to handle and meet the needs? One thing that we see from manufacturers, they aren't properly staffed, they aren't properly equipped, sometimes to no fault of their own. Maybe it's a slow media coverage day, and that recall happens to be picked up by the news media. But we see that spike in call volumes, the long hold times, and that results in a lot of consumer complaints, issues, messages on Facebook, Reddit, whatnot. So being properly staffed from a call center perspective is very important. Beyond that, product handling. So if you're getting the product back, are you equipped? Are you able to issue out a return kit to a consumer for them to return product? Are you able to pull product from your hospitals or from physicians and get it back into your facility? Also, once you've received that product, are you able to cord it off so that it doesn't get back into the stream? It's not distributed again. We've seen some manufacturers who they get the product back and they end up
Recall of a recall.
shipping it out, and they do a recall of a recall. Obviously, not an effective recall if you have to issue out a second recall following issuing it out incorrectly. Beyond that, you get into your remedy. Chris, I know you have some thoughts there.
Well, the biggest thing with the remedy, we know there's a lot of pressure at times from the C-suite executive team. What's the cheapest option? Now, there is a lot of litigation with recall, so a full refund typically helps that probably the most from what I've seen. Now, but a lot of time there's pressure. Well, just do a repair. Well, do you have the parts available based on the volumes? Can you get repair team out to do it? That could restrict you greatly. A replacement. Replacement's great because you can have them continue using their brand, which I love. But how quick can you get out those replacement units as well? Do you have the inventory based on different response levels as well? I've seen many companies get themselves in trouble where they overextended. One that always comes to mind is they were saying the replacement part would be available in 3 weeks, and a lot of them got it in 6 months, which obviously is really bad for the brand and reputation. So on the reimbursement side, we do see that quite a bit. The biggest thing I can say is just set realistic expectations. So, it's going to be 4 to 6 weeks for you to get your check or your virtual reimbursement. Make sure you stick to that. I see a lot of times the marketing, sales, executive teams say, we want to make them whole right away. Tell them 2 weeks. But then for some reason, they weren't able to get them out in 2-week time period. And you got a lot of angry customers who are calling in and trying to find out where is their reimbursement. So if you tell them 4 to 6 weeks and you get it to them in 2 to 3, great. You've exceeded their expectations. And sometimes if you do recalls right this way, I've actually seen brand loyalty increase, sales increase based on it. So just some things to remember. The last piece ties into what Matt was saying around product handling. How do you dispose of the product? Important to understand, sometimes the hazard of the recall will actually change how it's handled physically, how it's disposed of. The one that always comes to mind is lithium batteries. So they very tricky to recall and to transport. But then when it comes time to actually disposal of them, you can't do it in really a lot of the same fashions you may typically do with good batteries. So just be thinking about that type of information.
Good call out on the destruction piece there. Beyond that, so we get into the next piece, you go into adjustments. So you've issued your product recall, you have a plan, you feel your plan is good. Recalls, again, they're changing. So you have to be able to adjust with that recall. You need to be able to tweak your process kind of throughout. If there are some things that come about, a curveball that happens, how do you adjust to that? Are you nimble enough to make adjustments? I touched on the call center earlier. Call centers equipped with FAQs. You need to look at your FAQs, look at those consumer or customer facing documents as living documents. As you get more and more questions, more and more inquiries, are there adjustments that need to be made? Are there talking points that need to be added in so that you're handling those inquiries properly and to the best capability?
Yep. The one call out, and I know we're running a little short on time, so we'll speed through this a little bit. The one call I want to make, if your product does not have an expiration date, the recall never really closes. You can close it with the FDA, you can close it with the Consumer Product Safety Commission, but it's always out there. And companies need to realize this. Yes, you can you can shut down an 800 number and use your normal standard number or the website. You can point to another general website to get some information out. But your product's out there. It could potentially continue to cause harm. One of the tricky areas is these online marketplaces, especially these products that consumers really like to have. You'll see it pop up on online marketplaces. And, it's illegal to sell recall products. Unfortunately, a lot of these sellers, they don't always check. And unfortunately, a lot of the buyers don't always check, is what I'm buying recalled or not. So the unfortunate thing is you see this happen a year or two after a recall's been closed, and all of a sudden there's an injury and their name gets brought up right back into the marketplace. So this is why a lot of these companies are required and are actively monitoring these marketplaces to protect their brands. And it's just something you actively have to do. And you may make some adjustments through the life of it, but it's just something that, companies have to be aware of. Just because the recall's closed with the agency doesn't mean you have to stop taking action.
I know we're up against time, but one point on recall never closing, Chris touched on snowblowers. So those seasonal items, yes, you may close it, but once winter comes up, you're probably going to see an uptick. So it's something for manufacturers to think about. Next and last, and this is often overlooked, is lessons learned. So a lot of manufacturers don't focus as much on the recall readiness. They also don't focus on the lessons learned at the end. It's important to think about, how that recall happened, take an action internally to go through what lessons do we learn, what adjustments need to be made. Are there adjustments to your recall plan, to your SOPs, to your templates, more templates or checklists needed? And really summarize how that recall went. It's very important so that you're prepared for the next one, because a recall is going to happen if you're manufacturing and selling goods. So that's a very key piece that we see a lot of manufacturers overlook.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I get it. You want to move on and get back to selling product, back to your day job as well, especially if you're not accustomed to having product recalls. But it's definitely our last recommendation to make sure you do that peek back. And what we see a lot of times is companies that have a recall and they're the recall coordinator for that company. The next recall they have, if they're not having reoccurring, recalls, it's probably someone different. So making sure that, you take the time to understand what went well. Maybe we should have put different agreements in place. Maybe we should have done this a little bit differently, or maybe we received a massive spike in calls. How can you take that and apply it for the future? It definitely makes a massive difference on improving the future recalls, which unfortunately will happen.
Absolutely.
So with that, we definitely wanted to leave time for some questions. So again, you can put those directly into the chat module. I think we've got a couple minutes for some questions. There's one here that I'm looking at, refers to as a consumer, I've been impacted by multiple recalls in the past 12 months. Is there any indication of lowered response rates for consumers due to recall fatigue? And recall fatigue is something that we've seen pop up for a number of years. I mentioned 62 recalls announced weekly. Not all of those will go to the patient level, the consumer level. Not all of those will make the media, but a lot of them do make the media, especially social media, where you can see a lot of these. So how do you get consumers to pay attention? How do you get consumers to tune in? And it can be difficult. My own mom, I called after texting her about a carrot recall last year, and I called her, a few weeks later and said, "What are you doing?" And she said, "I'm eating carrots," and they were the recall carrots. So it is, it's problematic to get consumers to pay in. Now, I think there's different mechanisms to actually get consumers to pay attention. We are seeing additional rounds of notifications to get them. So maybe they just missed it. A lot of things are occurring in the news right now, so they didn't pay attention. But if you reissue a notification, maybe a different medium of notification to get them to actually, pay attention. The remedy is really helpful with that as well.
I was going to say incentivizing consumers. That's a big thing in order to increase that response. So providing some sort of an incentive, whether it be compensation, some sort of a coupon or something for product in the future, some sort of incentive for them to respond to the recall does help to increase the response rates there.
Yeah. I mean, it is one that, if you're doing things as normal, you could see a dip, because it is a battle with consumers. What are they taking seriously? We did a consumer survey that we can send out the pulse report related to that. It just gives a little bit more sentiment to consumers and how they feel about recalls. Another question here, could you please describe your current involvement in Canadian pharmaceutical industry, and do you manage recalls from end to end, including So just to keep this short, yes, we do Canadian product recalls. Some of those have some different notification with the competent authorities within the different provinces. But we do all the way from notifications, response processing, call center, product handling, warehouse in Toronto, et cetera. And then same means from the different levels all the way to the patient, which could mean notification, call center, and remediation from those standpoint. Suggestions for monitoring the marketplace for products still in the market after the recall is officially over. So I think that's, what are the core marketplaces? So this is more consumer products. What are the core marketplaces that online that are selling? Mm-hmm. I don't want to name names specifically. Some of them actually do a better job of monitoring themselves and looking for product that's been recalled, and they'll pull it out as well. But a lot of companies now have teams that look at the major online marketplaces and they scan it. Now, there's some tools I think they utilize. Artificial intelligence, AI, is a tool that's being utilized, and a lot of them are doing that regularly to look for trends in products that may not even been recalled yet. So saferproducts.gov, their social media as well, the agency websites, retailers. But we had a retailer at the roundtable last week straight said, just ask me for all of our data on your products. We'll provide that to you, and you can help mine it to see, are there things occurring? So there is a lot of data out there. I do recommend tools like AI to be able to kind of root through that to see, what's popping up.
And we are seeing AI more and more frequently, across all industries, across all business, but AI is a key piece for mining that.
Yeah, there's certain online marketplaces that are probably more guilty than others. We can offline, give some recommendations on that as well. What are your thoughts on market withdrawals versus recalls? We always joke a market withdrawal is kind of the class 4. Mm-hmm. In the FDA, you always have a class 1, 2, and 3. They're run very similar to product recalls as well. They may have different attributes, but from our standpoint, the logistics associated with a withdrawal versus a recall can be very, very similar. Sometimes the reporting isn't. Now, we typically always recommend if a company is looking at running withdrawal, I always typically recommend still report to the FDA, because you don't know specifically, are they going to agree with that assessment? And you don't want a warning letter because you thought it was something that, maybe the FDA may have classified a little bit differently. Let's see. How can DME department be informed of recalls?
Yeah, I think that's a key piece that we're still, I think, across industry trying to learn a better practice and process. I've had several conversations with hospitals, for instance, on communication of recalls and effectively communicating those recalls. There are some requests or some needs on the hospital side, also on the DME side, that I think industry really honestly just needs to come together and understand what's the best practice. Sometimes hospital DMEs don't understand the FDA requirements necessarily that the manufacturer goes through, while the manufacturer doesn't understand, what your needs are and how you operate in the process. So I think there just needs to be more collaboration there. We don't have a good answer for you right now, but it's something that we're continuing to look at.
Well, we host, last couple of years, we've hosted these life science recall roundtables. Mm-hmm. So it would be great to get, a lot of times it is manufacturers that are involved with these, but we're trying to get DMEs, trying to get hospitals, trying to get other stakeholders in recall together to talk about the future, to talk about how can there be better communication, how can it be made easier. We always joke the FDA CFR 21 Part 7 still references faxing and I think telegrams as forms of notification. So, and again, the FDA has been okay with more digital forms of notices as well. We found problems a little bit within the adoption of some of that, but I think getting the industry together, talking through it, and coming up with some good ideas that work on all sides would be highly beneficial. How do you speak to legal teams who are against recall plans, which can be seen as a risk if they are not followed? I mean, that's a good question, but I do think, what is the risk to the brand and the company if you don't have a recall plan? That's a greater risk. the amount of litigation occurring in the US related to recalls is increasing and increasing. I guarantee you there's law firms that just look at how a recall's run and look at, are there opportunities for litigation or class action lawsuits? So I think reminding the legal team of the risk of not having a recall plan can be worse, where things don't get done right, they don't happen, they're slowed down, can create even more risk. So I think focusing on the risk too can be very valuable when talking to those legal teams. And it's funny, I have not heard that come up.
I've not either.
Very often from a legal team. We do a lot of recall readiness type exercises where legal is involved. That is interesting. I've not heard that come up too often where legal is pushing back based on recall plans. If you're a new manufacturer, what kind of tool sites would you recommend to use them for an active monitoring process? There are all sorts of tools. We can get some of that information and send it offline, but there's all sorts of tools to be able to monitor all the different avenues that patients and consumers use to give feedback directly to the manufacturers, to the retailers, but also to the agencies as well. Have you seen recall language in MSAs asking company that sells branded products but does not manufacture anything? I mean, this is pretty broad. In some cases within the MSAs, there's been no language related to it. Sometimes there's a side agreement that may mention some language around it. Again, when you're selling product, the seller buyer rarely wants to talk about what if there's an issue, and it makes compliance and quality and regulatory just really upset because they need to connect those dots. And unfortunately, the only dots sometimes they have to connect are the recalling firm to a buyer. And that's or buyer or seller. So that's not always the best way to do it. So I would say today we see a mix of what's included in the different.
I will say we also do see now more and more frequently where distributors or retailers, they're requiring that. They have their own language for product recalls that they're adding in, whether it be like an attachment, an appendix, an exhibit to the MSA. So more and more frequently, we're seeing the retailers, distributors also ask for that. So yeah, I think it's important to definitely include within your agreements.
Yeah, and if you're a retailer that's selling your own private label, but you're buying from a supplier, I mean, absolutely need to have recall in there. It absolutely helps from a cost standpoint. Who's responsible for what? Who's paying for what as well? I know we're out of our normal time, but we keep having questions. So I think Matt and I are going to continue to go through these questions. If you have to drop, we do thank you for joining, but we'll try to continue to answer some of these questions as they come in. Have you seen recall? Let's see. Do you notice consumer recall apps helping or hurting recall efforts? Does it create recall fatigue for consumers? So this has come up a lot throughout the years, an app that a consumer can look at. I think if it's specific to, let's say you just had a new baby, Matt just had a new baby. Maybe you want an app that walks through all and filters all the recalls for infant, baby, child type product. That might be useful, but we've seen it in some cases, it's just too much. Other times you can't solely rely on it because how is that data getting input in there? It may not be all inclusive. I know the platform may try to enter as much recall data in there as possible, but what we have seen is if you're getting all the data from these 60 plus recalls I just mentioned, again, not all of them go down to the patient or consumer level, it can be a lot.
Absolutely.
And that we hear as people start to tune out, unless it's filtered by a specific category. Yeah.
And I'll say consumers also just are becoming more and more reluctant for, adding a new app to their phone, going through the software, the data, having that included on. My wife is notorious. She does not like to have anything on her phone. She thinks she would be comfortable with a flip phone. So seeing that more and more frequently on top of the fatigue piece.
There's another more granular questions here. We'll try to address those offline, but looks like we've gotten through most of the questions, and I know we're about 8 minutes over. The rest of them we'll try to address offline. But I do want to thank the audience for joining us in this conversation. Matt, thanks for the dialogue back and forth. Be on the lookout for some of our future ones, which again, we like to keep conversational and not take a lot of your time up, but hopefully it was informative. Thank you very much for joining us today, and we hope you have a good rest of the day.
Thank you all.